Hello guys, David Vose here again. Beautiful day again here. Still cold, but sun's shining. Hope you're having a wonderful day where you are. Today I woke up and had no intentions of doing a video about this. We've done videos about this, but I clicked on something and just popped up, and it was a guy who was saying that the book of Matthew was really written in Hebrew. Now, mind you, we've never seen a Hebrew version of Matthew until the 14th century. This is a rumor or something that's been going around for a long time that says that Matthew was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew. And I've said that before because that's what everybody told me, that's what everybody says. But we don't have any. The Matthew that we have has Greek idioms. It's probably was never written in Hebrew. If it ever was written in Hebrew, it would have been a Hebrew translation of the original Greek Matthew. Matthew was probably written in Greek. We have no proof that any book of the Bible was ever written in Hebrew. Now, I'm going to show you that they want you to believe that. It's core to their belief system in this world. It's an elaborate hoax that's been going on since Roman days, where they manipulated even Josephus's writings to say that Josephus said that the Septuagint was made in Jerusalem. But again, the word that Josephus uses is not Jerusalem. And I've gotten AI to admit that here in a minute, but I'll show you. But the word that Josephus uses is Ariel Solomon, which is Arios is a distinctly Greek word that translates an Egyptian word. So, yeah, we don't necessarily have the hieroglyphs, but the Greeks would say Areopolis or Heliopolis or these words like on. But originally, the Egyptians call it the city of Ra. So, you see what I'm saying? When Josephus says Ariel Solomon, he's using a Greek word that definitively refers to the temple of Amun-Ra. Solomon, Amun-Ra, and it was the holy Amun-Ra. It was how they started everything off, right? They would always use this aerials, like hieroglyphs, holy writing, holy temple, the holy Solomon. So there is a lot of stuff that's been going on that's been used to lie for 2,000 years to twist the narrative so that people that might have come along, even 100 years later, church fathers, would have been fooled by this. Because remember, if you go back 100 years from now, that's before your mother and father were alive. That was your grandpa. A lot of people don't even know anything about their mother, or their grandpa or their grandfather or their grandmother. Or, we hear really a little bit. We hear very little about what happened in our grandpa's or great-grandpa's lives. We don't really know. I know almost virtually nothing about my grandpa and grandma on either side. Later on, I've done research and found out that my grandpa, my great-grandpa, my great-great-grandpa, and my great-great-great-grandpa all lived in California in Tiddletown. And I had no idea when I was growing up. So imagine church fathers lived 150, 280, telling you certain things that they were basing on lies that had been promoted right from the very beginning. Yes, there were Talmudic Jewish individuals that hated Jesus Christ. And immediately in 135, right after the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, Herod's temple, in 70 AD, and the Jerusalem, but not the Jerusalem, the Ariel Solomon temple that was destroyed in 70 AD as well by the Romans. Well, these Jews went to this certain location in the desert started up another Sanhedrin, because remember, the Sanhedrin then was destroyed. The Jewish Sanhedrin at Jerusalem, or Herod's temple, it was destroyed. So they started some other temple up with people that maybe were priests, like Levites, at least of heritage. And now this is 135, so this again is about 100 years after Christ. They hated the fact that at that time Christians were spreading everywhere. Everybody was becoming Christian. And so they immediately convened a Sanhedrin and appointed certain individuals. And their main job from that point forward was to destroy Christianity. And they started taking the Septuagint, which was Greek, and hiding the fact that the real area of Solomon, or the Temple of Solomon, and Heliopolis, where the original Bethel was, they tried to make this Hebrew up. And even, and remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were the 1st century. And at that time, there were individuals that may have been translating the Septuagint into some kind of Hebrew. But we don't know that there really ever was a Hebrew, if they even just made it up at the time. We do not know what ancient Israelites, what language they used. If they were in Egypt, they probably weren't speaking Hebrew. Although Canaanite is very similar to Hebrew, and the Canaanites, I've gotten AI to admit, were almost one and the same as Egypt. They were part of Egypt, which is something we've talked about before too. All of this is subterfuge, supposed evidence that isn't even really evidence that the Temple of Solomon or Bethel was ever in Philistia or Palestine. They have only 2 steles that they've ever discovered that mention Israel, but it's not pinpointed exactly where it was supposed to have been. It's just circumstantial evidence. There's very little. There's no plaque that says David built a city here or Solomon built his temple here. There's no remains. They've never found any remains of the Temple of Solomon anywhere underneath Herod's temple. Never. And Solomon's temple city was supposed to be the greatest city temple of the world. Whenever Solomon existed, 1000 BC, it had to have been the largest, or basically like the largest temple compound, the glory of all the earth, when everybody would come from all around the world, the Queen of Sheba, to see his glory. Solomon had to have been so amazing in real life, if you believe in the Bible, and yet they can't find a shred of it in Philistia. But we can find absolute proof that it was in Egypt. So this clip I was looking at showed a verse in Mathew where Jesus said, they sit in the seat of Moses, talking about the Pharisees and the scribes. They sit in the seat of Moses. And our Mathew translation today says, do what they say, because they sit in the seat of Moses. But they have this Hebrew version of Mathew. But remember, it's not real. It was written 1,400 years later by Talmudic Jews who hated Jesus, we'll see that it's verified that the reason they translated Mathew into Hebrew was because they didn't like Jesus, and they were trying to distort the Greek Mathew. So we have proof that Jews were trying to destroy Christianity. And even the Hebrew version of the Old Testament that we might have found after the 1st century, the Dead Sea Scrolls were about the 1st century. Some think slightly before, but could have been all the way up to about 70. We don't know when they were written, all these Dead Sea Scrolls. And some of them have Hebrew books written in Hebrew, but those are translated, they know, from a Septuagint version. The idioms and the phrases are all Septuagint, not from any original Hebrew. Now, they claim the opposite, but we'll go through that here in a minute. But they immediately changed that verse to do what they say, the Pharisees, because they sit in the seat of Moses, to don't do what they say, but they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what Moses said. In other words, Jesus is supposedly saying, believe in Moses. However, it's a rhetorical question or statement that Jesus is making. If you're going to believe in Moses, and Moses is an authority, then you should follow the lineage of authority. However, the true lineage of authority was the Zadokite priesthood. As Ezekiel tells us, King David chose the Zadokite priesthood. And from that time forward, according to the book of Ezekiel and the rest of the Bible, and scholars know this, the only legitimate priesthood was the Zadokite priesthood, which AI and every scholar knows was at Heliopolis, not at Herod's temple. So all of this is subterfuge and lies. And I want to read to you the conversation or argument that I had with AI this morning. So I said, they sit in the seat of Moses, do what they say. And they say, well, that phrase comes from Matthew 23:2. In the Bible, where Jesus tells his followers to obey the teachings of the scribes and Pharisees, who sat in the authority of Moses' seat, because they expound deity's law but do not follow their hypocritical actions. As they preach but do not practice. It's a warning about distinguishing between legitimate religious instruction and personal behavior, emphasizing true righteousness over outward show. The seat of Moses. This refers to a physical place in synagogues where teachers of the law, scribes and Pharisees, would sit to interpret and teach the Torah, symbolizing their authority to expound deity's word. Now, we've also covered this recently about the authority to interpret Torah has another phrase in the New Testament where Jesus says they have the keys of knowledge, but they don't go in, neither do they let anyone else go in. The key of knowledge was the key that was symbolically given to the rabbis to interpret Torah, but they had the wrong interpretation. They took it literally, and the temple was not written about to be created literally, but it was a symbolic temple that represented your body or the universe. And the holy place was within us that we were trying to get into the presence. So they didn't teach it right. They had the key, but they didn't teach it right. So this is another idea in that venue. But if they were teaching the outward literal meaning, and there's very little way you could misunderstand the literal meaning, build a temple. Okay, build a temple. Make it this size. Make it that high. Do these laws. Do these rituals. Do these ceremonies. Well, they were doing all of that and insisting upon it. So they were teaching the literal law. However, the key to knowledge was that they were supposed to interpret the meaning. It wasn't, remember, like the chalkboard illustration we gave. The lines on the chalkboard aren't the meaning. It's what those mathematical figures represent. The meaning is what is the real meaning of the law. See, it wasn't intended to be taken literally, and they had the key. They knew about the esoteric, but they didn't teach the esoteric. They taught the literal part of the law to keep everybody in line. So, yes, that's literally what Jesus meant. Yes, there is a Torah, there is a law, but I don't keep the law literally. I don't stone adulterers. I don't bow down to this deity. So how is it they were worshiping the devil then if they did have the Torah? And the Torah really did come from our Heavenly Father. Well, because our Heavenly Father is the light, the spiritual, on Mount Horeb. And the law that he got on Mount Sinai is the exact same law, but in its literal sense. In other words, you have the spirit and you have the flesh. They were looking at the flesh, the outer, and completely not looking at the inner. Jesus told them, cleanse the inner and the outer will be cleansed already. Don't worry about the literal. That's the outer man. The literal, not only is it not important, but if you try to go about cleansing the outside of the cup and not even thinking about the inside, you're not getting to the most important point. the truth. There is these words that represent truth. Get to the truth. They weren't getting to the truth. So what is the devil? The devil is the law, or the opposite of the spirit, which is the flesh. It is the opposite of the truth, which is the lie. And it is the literal letters of the law as opposed to the spiritual meaning. So the divine being is real, the light. But they couldn't see the light or grasp it. They got the veil that Moses came down off the mountain with because they couldn't understand the meaning. The veil was the letter. And their deity then is the reflection of deity. Vengeance is not the true nature of our Heavenly Father. He's love. So it's the opposite, the outer: hate, jealousy, vengeance. That's why the devil that they worship was Satan, and it was Yahweh. I am vengeance, I am hate. But the other I am, which is the higher consciousness, is I am love and I am truth. They didn't notice the two distinctions. They were looking at the outer physical and ignoring the spiritual intent, or the truth, which is not only inner but above. So yes, they worship the devil, or the outer understanding, or the image, the idol, not the true light, but gold, the golden calf. The calf represented the power of deity, the bull. So they were worshiping a bull, but not the power. And then it was shiny gold made out of ore. O-R means light, but it's congealed light. It's not the true light, but it's a shiny, materialistic, other kind of light. They were worshiping mammon, or material things, or idols. They made an image of deity. They didn't worship deity, they worshiped an image. So that image is the devil, which doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. It's a shiny golden calf. It's an idol. The command Jesus instructs, so you must be careful to obey everything they tell you, refers to the law. Well, yeah. You must be careful to do everything they tell you, but then do not do what they do. So if they tell you something and you have to do what they tell you, but you don't do what they do, that certainly would show that they were hypocrites. But what were they telling people? Well, that would then go to the interpretation. And Jesus had already said they had the key of knowledge, but they didn't go in nor allow anyone else to go in. So though they may have known what the truth was, and anyone who wanted to know could have probably known, even the Pharisees knew the truth, but they weren't doing or truly teaching the truth. They were being hypocrites. So let's take a look at that verse real quick before we move on here. So Matthew 23 says, Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. Now, let's not get carried away and misunderstand. Moses was a high priest ordained of deity. He had the Melchizedek priesthood from Jethro, who was Reuel. We've talked about all of that. He married Reuel's daughter, Zipporah, and therefore became the, when you marry a daughter, it's like you're the heir of that priesthood. It was a king priesthood. But because the people denied Horeb, the light, or the new covenant, or the original everlasting covenant of light, and they chose to worship a golden calf when he came down from the mountain, he broke the commandments and ground it into powder and put it into water, and they drank it. But they demanded vengeance. They rejected love. So Moses went up to Mount Sinai, which is Shin, which is the moon, remember the mother deity, went to Mama. And what is Mama? Well, we've said Eve or Mama is the conscious mind. And that's how things would be in the conscious mind, vengeance and hate. If it was not trained, had not yet become wisdom. Because eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil gives you some knowledge, but you got to keep going until you acquire wisdom. And then you get your white robe, or you become like deity. So the moon is wandering back and forth from dark to light, dark to light. It's good and evil. Mother Eve was going through the maze, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what they received then is not the light from the higher consciousness, the sun, but they received the sheen or the shining from Mother Eve, going back and forth in the duality of good and evil. And it means then that Yahweh says, I am the deity that creates good and evil, light and darkness. I do all things. And he thinks he's the only one. He says, I am deity, there is none else. Besides me, there is no deity, because, which is not true, because we know that beside the Father is the Son. And of course, his wife. But Yahweh divorced his wife, right? Through the law, he cursed the earth, he cursed everything. So they followed good and evil and vengeance, the deity of Yahweh, and the law. Moses didn't want them to not be aware of the light. He offered it to them, but they couldn't grasp it, so Moses veiled it. He came down off the mountain with a veil. And this is why the Apostle Paul says when they read the Old Testament, they read it with a veil. So this is all part of the New Testament. Jesus knew full well that Moses sat in the seat of authority, but these Jews had rejected his truth. And what they were telling them, they were supposed to observe, but not to do what they're doing, because they're liars and they've gone astray. They're worshiping a golden calf. So look at what it says in the Greek here to get the whole. So it says, on Moses' seat have sat down the scribes and the Pharisees. All things, therefore, how many? If they might tell you, keep and observe. After, however, the works of them not do. Okay, so what is this word we should keep? Let's look at that word keep. All right, it says down here, with the names of the things made to produce, construct, form, or fashion, etc. So you produce or construct something or fashion something. So what they say, observe it, and we're going to use it to produce or fashion something. Down here it says to make a path. So he's not necessarily saying keep the literal sense of the law. And elsewhere throughout the entire New Testament, Jesus says, do not keep the literalness of the law. In fact, the whole chapter there in Mathew contradicts that notion that Jesus wanted you to take that Torah literally, right? He's talking about the inside of the cup and the outside. The spiritual and then the outside is not the true meaning. We're talking about what's inside. So he says, yeah, when they tell you the things that Moses said, then use that not to do what they say literally, but to use it to make a path. And then the next word, as we saw, was to observe. Yes, we should observe it. And then understand it. And that's where a couple of verses later, Jesus goes back, I'll show you, and talks about the key. Yeah, down here in verse 13, woe unto the scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. But in another place, he talks about it as a key, that they don't use it to go in. And that was a Hebrew idiom at that time, that rabbis had this symbolic key to interpret the scriptures, to go into the esoteric meaning. What he's saying is that the Torah was an esoteric teaching. The literal part is not the part that we are to do, but we are to observe what Moses said and make a path with it, because we're looking at the inside of the cup and not the outside, and that the Pharisees are talking about the literal outside. So that's why he says, they're blind guides, ye fools. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, verse 25, for ye make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind guides, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. So he's saying, observe Moses, but understand it's a spiritual teaching. So, I mean, I could go into that in depth, but there's no other way to understand it. Jesus did not want them to keep the literal part of the law, like do this, do that. But we're talking about a spiritual treatise written by Moses that was veiling the real truth. That's perfectly clear. And even Jewish individuals know that, but they don't like to talk about it. So let's go back then to what we were saying, what we were arguing with AI about. So why did Hebrews who don't believe in Jesus write a Hebrew version? So they say, while the primary language of the New Testament is Greek, Hebrew versions of the Gospel of Matthew were preserved and transcribed by Jewish communities who did not believe in Jesus for specific historical and theological reasons. So they didn't believe in Jesus, but they had a Hebrew version of Matthew. Now, Christians didn't have one. They had one years later because they didn't believe in Jesus. Why did they have it? Well, in the Middle Ages, particularly in Spain, Jews were often forced into public disputations, debates, with Catholic officials intended to prove Christianity's superiority. To survive these high-stake debates, Jewish rabbis needed to study Christian texts to identify contradictions or logical flaws. Shem Tob's Mathew, 1380, the 14th century. The most famous example is found within the work Even Bohan, the Touchstone, by Rabbi Shem Tob ben Isaac ben Shaprut. He included a Hebrew version of Matthew to equip fellow Jews with arguments against Christian doctrines like the Trinity and the virgin birth. See, all the Hebrew versions of the Bible deny the virgin birth and that Jesus died on a cross. Our Bible says that Jesus was nailed to a cross in Psalms chapter 22. In their version, the Hebrew version, it doesn't mention him dying on a cross. In our version, the Septuagint version, it mentions the virgin birth, but in their version, it doesn't mention the virgin birth. So in every case, whatever Hebrew you may find of the Bible is a made-up Bible that we will show you, even though they're going to try to make you think it's not made up. But I will show you, and on my argument with them, they finally concede. But you gotta see this. The identifying of the hypocrisy. Some Jewish scholars use Hebrew versions of the gospel to point out that contemporary Christians were not following Jesus' own instructions. By reading Matthew 23:2, do what they say. It doesn't actually say that, like we said. These scholars argued that Jesus himself commanded his followers to obey the law of Moses, a command they felt the church had abandoned. However, if they read the rest of the book of Matthew or any other Christian document, you'd find that Jesus called them hypocrites because they tried to take it literal and follow the law. And when they found a woman who had been caught in adultery, the very act, and the law required to stone her, Jesus said, "No, you hypocrites." When they found Jesus breaking the Sabbath, literally harvesting grain on the Sabbath because they were hungry, the Pharisees said, "You're breaking the law." And Jesus said, "My father's not even your father. Your father's the devil." And who was the devil? Nobody. Just the illusion or the outward manifestation, the letter of the law, your own deception, your lower ego, vengeance and hate, which has nothing to do with the light on Mount Horeb. You're following this lower ego going through this desert, wandering back and forth like the waning and waxing of the moon between day and night, good and evil. He's a liar and a murderer. My father keeps on working until now, and I keep working. So we could go through all the way through the New Testament to prove that Jesus never taught the literal commandments as something enjoined upon humans, but that they were symbolic and referred to something esoteric. So they thought they were preserving the ancient tradition. There is a long-standing scholarly debate about whether these Hebrew versions were simply translations from Greek or if they were based on an original Hebrew source. Now, I see how they word that. In fact, already they say something about they had Hebrew versions of the gospel. That's just completely ludicrous. There are no Hebrew versions until 14th century. Now, to conclude then from that they were using other versions that somehow existed, but we just don't have them, and to not realize that they literally made it up in the 14th century to oppose Christianity is ludicrous. But this is what AI is doing because they're being financed by the people who don't believe in the Bible or Jesus, Jewish individuals. So we go down and I say, is there an authentic Hebrew or Aramaic version of Mathew? And they say, well, there is no universally accepted. You know how they always say that? They can't just say, no, there isn't. They have to say, well, it's not universally accepted. In other words, nobody believes it. But they try to, mask it with wording. No authentic, quote. All right. They got versions of it that's not authentic because it was written in the 14th century by people who hate Jesus. So why don't you just say that? No authentic original Hebrew or Aramaic manuscripts of Mathew. There are three distinct types of versions that are central to the historical and scholarly debate. Lost original Hebrew Aramaic Matthew. Ancient church fathers from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, Papias, Irenaeus, Origen, and Jerome, repeatedly claim that Matthew first wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language. But here's what they don't tell you. What was the Hebrew language? We don't know that the Hebrew or people called Israel ever spoke a language called Hebrew. We have no proof of that. And as I'm going to prove to you, they lived in Egypt, not where they're claiming they lived. They had to have spoken the language of Egypt in the hieroglyphic language, not the Coptic, because the Coptic wasn't invented until 300 BCE. Now, the Septuagint was written in Greek, but what they translated the Septuagint from, we do not know. Now, they're going to say that somebody like Josephus said it must have been Hebrew. But as I'm going to point out to you, we do not know what the Hebrew people spoke, what language they spoke. If they lived in Egypt or Canaan, and they're going to prove to you and confirm to you, like I'm going to tell you, that the Canaanites were Egyptians. There were different groups in Egypt, Hyksoks and Canaanites and Hebrews and all these different people. But they were Egyptian. They all spoke a language that was like a Canaanite Egyptian type language, but was the original hieroglyphic language, the holy writing. So, status, the document is lost to history. So we don't have a Hebrew version of Mathew, like everybody claims. All we know is that early church fathers like Papias, Irenaeus, and Origen, and Jerome said that there was an original Mathew written in some other language that may have been the language that people called Hebrews may have spoke. But if those Hebrew people lived in Egypt, it wasn't the language that we have today called Hebrew. So, scientific consensus. Most modern scholars believe the Gospel of Matthew we have today was composed originally from the Koine Greek because it relies heavily on other Greek sources like the Gospel of Mark. Okay, did you see that? Scientific consensus, all the consensus. Even though I don't like going by consensus because the consensus of scholars is usually flawed. But in this case, they got it. The scholars' consensus is that modern scholars believe the Gospel of Matthew that we have today was composed originally in the Koine Greek, not the Hebrew, because it relies heavily on other Greek sources like the Gospel of Mark. Shem Tob's Hebrew Matthew 1380 AD. This is the version often cited by those looking for an authentic Hebrew text. It was embedded in the 14th century anti-Christian polemic, written by the Spanish Rabbi Shem Tob ben Isaac ben Shaprut. Now, in case you guys start thinking, he was in Spain, therefore he was probably from the Languedoc, from Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ, Sephardic Jewish people. No, these were rabbis who were Ashkenazi that had already come down there, and they're the ones who wrote the Kabbalah and tried combating the original Cathar Christianity by writing the Kabbalah, because the original Christians from Jesus did have esoteric meaning to the scriptures. So they then stopped trying to fight that because Jesus' followers were winning. So they went and made their own esoteric works of the Old Testament called Kabbalah, which denied Jesus still. And they were Ashkenazi Jewish infiltrators. They were not Sephardic Jews that did this, that wrote this 14th century Hebrew version of Matthew. Because the original descendants of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene in the Languedoc of France, and that were expelled, and then some of them went to Spain, they literally translated the Bible and preserved it from the Koine Greek, because they had the knights that was protecting the Holy Grail and the Holy Textus Receptus, which meant the received text, which was Greek. And they specifically said, the true Christians, Cathars, from Mary Magdalene and Jesus, specifically taught the only true teachings came from the accepted Greek Septuagint. They did not believe in any Hebrew and did not possess any Hebrew manuscripts. And that's a fact, Jack. So, then the Aramaic Peshitta is a theory. A minority of scholars and groups, like the Assyrian Church of the East, argue the Peshitta represents the original Aramaic from which the Greek New Testament was translated. Most textual critics believe the Peshitta is the 4th or 5th century translation from Greek into Syria. So it was not the original, the Peshitta, the Aramaic. That's a big lie. Another big lie. It was Aramaic or Syriac, but it was translated from the original Greek. All we have is the original Greek, guys. So I wrote, isn't it true that there is evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew are translations of the Septuagint, because more of the phrases from the Dead Sea or wordings are directly from the Greek Septuagint, even if they were found in Hebrew? And they said, well, actually, here's where their bias comes in. Actually, the consensus among the scholars is the reverse. The Dead Sea Scrolls, DSS, provide evidence that the Greek Septuagint was a faithful translation of the existing Hebrew source. They call it the Vorlaga, but that's just their word for something that doesn't exist. That was different from the traditional Masoretic text. So the Masoretic text is proven to be completely made up. And the Septuagint is proven to be faithful, a faithful translation. However, they're claiming there was an original Hebrew. Now, here's how they come to that conclusion. And that's why they're saying it the consensus of the scholars. Rather than the Hebrew scrolls being translations of the Greek, now this is a new one, by the way. They used to say, oh, well, there's some of these Hebrew translations that follow the Greek, yes. But there's some that follow the Hebrew, and then they had to give that up. Because I argued with them for hours and told them, no, you're manipulating it. There's not one place that you can prove follows the Hebrew idiom. They were translating from the Greek, and they're like, well, you're right, we don't really have any proof. So now they're saying, oh yeah, well, there's another logic. We found that there must have been some original manuscript. We're going to call it the Borlage. And before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, many believed the differences in the Septuagint were due to bad or loose translations. The discovery of the Hebrew scrolls, like the 4Q Sam, a fragment of the book of Samuel. By the way, these are fragments. They have got no books in Hebrew. And these fragments are from the 1st century, up to 70 AD, after Christ. The discovery of the Hebrew scroll, a fragment of the book of Sag, changed this because the Hebrew text contains the exact phrases found in the Septuagint, but missing from the Masoretic text. Okay, that proves something? Proves my point that these Masoretic scribes are liars and the Septuagint is the true text. But notice what they say. Psalms 22:16, in the famous pierced my hands and my feet, verses like a lion, debate the Dead Sea Scroll fragment from Nahal Heber contains the Hebrew word ka'aru, they pierced, which matches the Septuagint and predates the Masoretic like a lion. And the scholars categorize the DSS into 3 main streams. Proto-Masoretic closely resembles the traditional Hebrew Bible. See, they throw that in, but they don't prove it. And the pre-Samaritan aligned with the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Septuagint, aligned Hebrew texts that provide the basis for the Greek translation. Well, there may have been a Samaritan version, because that's from Samaria, which is the 10 tribes. The capital of the 10 tribes was Samaria. So they're still Israelites, just not Jews. But this idea that they were pre-Masoretic Hebrew, there's no basis for that. They never give you any basis. They sometimes try to say it. So it says why that matters. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that the Greek translators were not making things up. Okay, they keep proving my point, but somehow they're going to get around to their point, right? Like I said, the Greeks didn't make it up or misinterpret the text. They were actually translating, now here's their lie, a specific Hebrew version. Well, they were translating some version. The Septuagint's a translation, but they were in Egypt when they did it at a temple at Heliopolis, where they were all associated with the Alexandrian temple. These were like Philo and Pliny and Josephus. They all seemed to hang around the Alexandrian library. And today we think, oh, it's a library. They were in there, checking out some books. That was a priesthood, the Alexandrian library. Only priests were able to write and read. They weren't peasants, they were priests. Philo and Josephus and Pliny, Plutarch, all these guys were priests. If you say, oh, they were historians, or oh, they were this, that's what a priest was, a scribe. So all of these were priests, even though they don't want you to know that. And they weren't priests at Herod's temple, they were priests at the Alexandrian temple, and they were the individuals, that group of individuals at the Alexandrian library, which was moved there from Heliopolis, that was a Jewish temple, but not Jewish, but an Israelite temple. And we do not know what language they spoke, only that they lived in Egypt, and therefore probably spoke the Holy Writing. And especially if we can prove that Ariel Solomon, that they translate Jerusalem, is really the temple at Karnak or the temple of Amun-Ra. I say, but you do not have the specific Hebrew original that the Septuagint was translated from. So that theory is not proved. It is most likely that the Septuagint was the first Bible, and if they translated it from something else, it could have been Coptic or hieroglyphics or Canaanite or Persian, But you are quoting propaganda from the Hebrew origin theory that is lacking evidence. I see those a lot with AI. Your programmers are telling you a lie. So I say, well, so Hebrew, as Josephus called it, was a language Josephus did not know, not the original. As you said, it is related to Canaanite. Maybe it was Canaanite or other Semitic writings. Besides, the Jews that translated the Bible in 280 BCE were in Egypt and were priests of Alexandria from Heliopolis, where the Zadokite priesthood was at the Leontopolis temple. Is there any evidence that Philo, Josephus, or Pliny, or any others were students, priests, or taught at the Zadokite priesthood in Heliopolis? And they say, while some scholars link the temple of Onias at Leontopolis, Onias, by the way, is that Greek word with the ius at the end, syntax. The word is on. We would translate that today as John, the temple of John. That in itself is mind-blowing when you consider that he was at the house of On, Beth Ani, and his name was John, and he was the Zadokite priest. And he was the priest over all the mystery schools throughout the world, which Heliopolis was. That is conclusive, but they don't want to show you that. The evidence is conclusive, but they're ignoring it, guys. So, the temple of Onias at Leontopolis, within the district of Heliopolis, to the Zadokite priesthood, there is no direct evidence that Philo, Josephus, or Pliny the elder were students or priests of this specific institution. Well, if they were scholars, they were priests. If they were scribes or writing books or historians or anything like that, they were priests by definition. I don't know why, maybe they can't find that particular word priest in some particular way or in that language never was used for them. But if the word historian, scribe, scholar, or anything else was ever used for Pliny, Josephus, or Philo, or any of these others, then they were priests. Connection to the Zadokite priesthood. The temple of Onias was founded around 155 BCE by John IV, or possibly John III, who was a legitimate heir to the Zadokite line of high priests. After being ousted from Jerusalem by the Hellenizing party, that's also over-exaggerated. They weren't ousted. There is a whole argument that people keep saying that they originally went to Jerusalem. No, all that actually happened was that Jews were trying to find a place to rebuild Jerusalem. Most of them were going to Egypt, either the Elephantine or the area up around Heliopolis, and rebuilding the temple. There was one group, the ones that we hear about all the time now, because, they ended up becoming Herod's temple and all the scuttlebutt we've been hearing, because that's where Jesus ended up going to them, and they crucified him. However, Jesus was teaching at Bethany, and there's clear indications that both of these temples was existing, that James the Just was a teacher, the teacher of righteousness at Heliopolis. But they're trying to get you to believe that they were ousted from Jerusalem, but they never were ousted. They simply were separate from the Jerusalem individuals who had a different priesthood that was rejected not only by them, but the Essenes rejected them. The Essenes were literally aligned with the Zadokite priesthood, which we know was at Heliopolis. So the Dead Sea Scrolls is about Heliopolis, not about Jerusalem at Herod's temple, and they are lying. So the location, while traditionally identified with Leontopolis, some scholars suggest its broader religious and cultural context was tied to the nome of Heliopolis. It functioned as a rival to the Jerusalem temple, with a legitimate Zadokite priest at its head. So it's a rival only in that it's the true temple, and the rival was the one at Jerusalem, Herod's temple, which was the false temple, which the Dead Sea Scrolls exactly prove. Evidence for Philo, Josephus, and Pliny, despite their proximity to or writing about this temple, no evidence links these individuals to its priesthood or education. Well, they weren't priests up at Jerusalem. They were at the Alexandrian library, which was an extension of the Heliopolis priesthood. Guys, they're lying. Philo of Alexandria, not Philo of Jerusalem. Alexandria is the library that they put there because when Alexander the Great destroyed Heliopolis, they removed the library to Alexandria and named it after Alexander the Great, but it's the continuation of the priesthood of Heliopolis. And Philo of Alexandria isn't just some guy that lived in a town named Alexandria. He was a priest, a scholar, and was there at the Alexandrian library or temple. Oh my goodness, a prominent Jewish philosopher. What is a philosopher? A philosopher, what are they saying? He followed Plato? Well, Plato followed Pythagoras, who followed Solon, and these guys were priests from Egypt. Pythagoras went down to Egypt and learned all the ways of the Egyptians. And he also went to Athens, and he also went to Zoroastrian schools and to India, just as Jesus did. It tells you that Jesus, up until he was 30, from 18 to 30, he went to India. All of them, Alexander the Great did this. He learned from Aristotle, who was an Egyptian priest. Aristotle and Plato were Egyptian priests. And therefore, if he was a philosopher, that is a term of a priest from the Egyptian priesthood. So Alexandria was a temple, and Philo was a philosopher, which means a priest from the school of Egypt. That's a fact, Jack. So it says that he held the Jerusalem temple in high esteem and likely never functioned as an active priest at Leontopolis. It says likely. Wonder why they say likely, because they know that I'm right, that it's probably true, but they're trying to say they don't have proof, but only because they don't want to share with you the proof that actually exists, the same proof I'm giving to you now, that the word philosopher meant a priest of the Egyptian priesthood. Following in the priesthood line of Pythagoras, Solon, Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Plato. Those were the philosophers, and they were priests, and they were functioning priests at Leontopolis. And the idea that they revered Jerusalem would be a farce if they were from Alexandria, because it's not the word Jerusalem that's the word that Philo or Josephus used. They used the word the Holy Solomon, which doesn't mean Jerusalem. It means Arios. It's an Egyptian designation of Karnak. Josephus, he was a priest of the 24 courses. He was from Arios-Solomon. They are lying about all of this. And then they say not Egypt. Well, Arios-Solomon was in Egypt. While he provides the most detailed history of the Temple of Onias or John, his accounts are often contradictory or biased, portraying it at times as a center of sedition or an unlawful rival to Jerusalem. Well, it's all mixed up. If it was a rival to Arios-Solomon, it wasn't a rival to Jerusalem. So we'd have to go back and look at the actual wording and translate Josephus from the original Greek, which would be difficult to do right now. Pliny the Elder, as a Roman author and naturalist, Pliny wrote about Egyptian geography, but had no known personal or professional affiliation with Jewish priestly institutions. No, because he didn't affiliate with Jerusalem. He was a priest or a naturalist or a Roman author because Rome was in a confederacy with Egypt. Remember, Cleopatra was married to Julius Caesar. They were a confederate. Rome included all of Egypt, Persia, Rome, Europe, all of it. They're just so biased. Translations of the Septuagint. Historical accounts such as the letter of Aetius states that Septuagint was translated by 72 elders from Jerusalem. No, they were 72 elders from the library at Alexandria. And the word Jerusalem is Solomon, and they are lying. And it says that this event occurred over a century before John IV founded the temple at Leontopolis. Well, they said that there was no Zadokite temple. That's not true. I'll show you. Well, here it says, the term Hebrew used by Josephus referred to the ancestral language of the Jews, which belongs to the Canaanite branch. So, it was a Canaanite language, not modern Hebrew. I said, but we do not know the exact date the Septuagint was translated. And we do not know if there were Jews in Heliopolis before Onias 3. Also, when Josephus or any others say it was at Jerusalem the translation happened, isn't the word they use Solomon, not Jerusalem? Solomon is a distinctly Egyptian. Arios is not the translation of Juru, which might mean light, and Arios means holy. The Ariosopolis or hieroglyphs. Now, I write very... They seem to understand what I'm saying. I write so fast that I don't spell anything. While the specific timeline of Jewish presence in Heliopolis is still researched, the linguistic and historical link between Solomon and holy terminology are well documented. Yes, you are correct that Solomon is a distinct Greek form that differs from the transliterated Jerusalem or Jerusalem. The Greek re-etymolization, ancient Greek speakers and writers, including Josephus, often use Solomon to make the foreign name sound more Greek. Well, they're saying they wanted to make it sound more Greek. Why? They used the word Solomon, not Jerusalem, only because they wanted to sound Greek. Well, they're stupid. Arios means holy. This first part of the word was intentionally aligned with the Greek word Arios, meaning holy, as seen in terms like hieroglyphs or holy carving, Ariopolis, city, holy city. Soloma, the second part, was often associated with Solomoi, an ancient people mentioned by Homer. Distinction. In Jewish Greek literature, Jerusalem was typically used for sacred or biblical contexts, while Solomon was used as a profane or secular name for the city at Greco-Roman context. Well, Jerusalem was used not because it was sacred, but because the people that were taking over Rome, the Jews from Herod's temple, that were so disruptive, they had to go in and murder them all. They were the ones that were tampering with texts and trying to say that it was the holy place. But actually, the holy Solomon was Amun-Ra at Karnak. So, historical records confirm a significant Zadokite presence in the land of Onias or John of Heliopolis, but the timing relative to the Septuagint is debated. The timeline, most historians place the founding of the temple of Onias at Leontopolis around 155 to 163 BCE. Onias or John IV roughly 120 years after the traditional date of the Septuagint translation. But the early presence theory, some modern scholars suggest an earlier Jewish temple or community might have existed in Egypt as early as 270 BCE. Oh, well, they forgot to tell us that. That would overlap with the Septuagint's creation. Oh, I guess I'm right. Priestly links. While Josephus was a Jerusalem-based priest, or an Solomon, which is Karnak, of the 24 courses, he wrote extensively about the Heliopolitan temple, noting it was staffed by priests of the proper lineage Zadokite. However, there is no direct evidence that Philo or Josephus were educated at that specific Egyptian temple, and they were generally, in other words, they were educated in Egyptian temples, but they don't have proof of that specific Egyptian temple, and they are generally associated with the broader intellectual centers of Alexandria and Jerusalem. No, Alexandria and Solomon, both of which are in Egypt. Ariel Solomon is Egyptian, while the Ariel's prefix is Greek. The name Jerusalem itself appears in much older Egyptian execration texts, 1900 BCE. Yeah, it does appear because there was a Jerusalem. That's a different city. They call it Rosh Hashanah or something, or Jerusalem. So I said, I've proven the Canaanites were in Egypt. So everything you're suggesting is supported by conjectures that have become established convictions by liars. The truth is obvious. The true city of deity was Karnak, Amun-Ra, or Solomon, and Heliopolis, as is proved by Isaiah 19:19. There is no actual proof the city of David or Solomon was in Palestine, or that Canaanites were that far north. The city sits on the Gihon Spring River. That's the Nile. The theory you are presenting aligns with Egypt-centric alternative chronologies and geographic revisions. Below is the historical and archaeological context regarding these specific points as of 2026. The Canaanites in Egypt. There is substantial evidence that Canaanites were present in Egypt, particularly during the Second Intermediate period from 1650 to 1550. The Hyksos, this group of West Semitic Canaanite origin, ruled northern Egypt from their capital at Avaris. Archaeological excavations there have uncovered Canaanite-style dwellings, pottery, and burial customs. Well, remember, guys, I had said that Canaan was the east side of the river of the Nile. The west side of the river Nile was Egypt, because they had to cross the river and go down into Egypt as the sun's going down in the west. The sun comes up in the east, which is the Sinai Peninsula, and that area there at Avaris is also on the east side. So that would be where the Canaanites were. And that pretty much confirms that the Canaanites were in the modern day area called Egypt, but on the east side of the Nile River. Interface. Scholars confirm that Egyptian and Canaanite cultures were deeply interconnected through trade, patronage, and migration for centuries. Isaiah 19:19 and Heliopolis. You reference Isaiah 19:19, which mentions an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt. City of the Sun, verse 18, mentions 5 cities in Egypt. Verse 18 of that same chapter, Isaiah 19:18, mentions 5 cities in Egypt, speaking the language of Canaan, one of which is called the City of the Sun. That's the city of Heliopolis, or Ra, or On. Most biblical scholars identify this as Heliopolis, the center of Ra worship. Some interpret this prophecy as a future conversion of Egypt, while others link it to the Jewish temple established later at Leontopolis. Or others say it was rebuilt there on the same location that the original temple of Ra was. Duh. Karnak and the city of deity. The Karnak temple complex was the primary residence of Amun-Ra, the king of the deities, for nearly 3,000 years. Solomon connection. While Solomon is a popular folk etymology in alternative theories, there sure are a lot of these folk etymologies, and all of it together couldn't possibly be coincidence. Mainstream linguistics derives Solomon from the Hebrew root SLM, which means peace. And there is no archaeological inscription at Karnak that identifies the city as the biblical city of David. Well, no, it's identified as the city of Solomon, Amun-Ra. Goodness gracious. And the word David is another language for the same word as Pharaoh, actually, because the house of David is the word Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the house of Ra, and the house of Diva is just the Indo-European root of Ra, or sun. The Shishak relief. Karnak does contain a famous relief by Pharaoh Shishong in Shishak, listing over 150 captured cities in Palestine, including sites in Judah and Israel, which scholars used to argue that the biblical kingdom was a distinct entity in the Levant. The Gihon Spring versus the Nile. In traditional geography, the Gihon Spring is a specific subterranean karst spring located in the Kidron Valley east of the city of David in Jerusalem. Evidence in Palestine. Archaeological excavations have uncovered massive 10th century BCE fortifications and a water system specifically designed to protect and divert the Gihon water into the city. Well, they're calling it Gihon now, but it didn't have that name then. They just found some canal, and they go, oh, this is it, But the Nile identification, the identification of Gihon as the Nile originates from interpretation, not the interpretation. It literally says in Genesis 2:13. It's not an interpretation, and the Septuagint proves it, which states that the Gihon winds through the entire land of Cush, often associated with Ethiopia and Egypt. However, in the context of the city of David, 2 Samuel 5:8, the Gihon is described as a local spring used for the coronation of Solomon. Yeah, Solomon, Amun-Ra, who was in Egypt. And there's more than just that one verse. We know that Jerusalem was built on the bank of the Gihon, which is the Nile. We cannot find one shred or proof, not even a pile of rocks, that could be Solomon's temple. We know the Karnak temple has the east gate facing a Mount of Olives, which is Mount Horeb in Sinai. And the two pillars of Boaz and Jachin are seen there today. The southeast corner has the pool for priests cleansing, where it is exactly in Solomon's temple, and Sol Amun is the same as Amun-Ra. The two temples are same dimensions, and if Solomon was so great that all the world paid tribute taxes when the Queen of Sheba to see his glory, it seems quite obvious the largest temple city in the world then, or after, for some time, was Karnak. They say historical and archaeological records from 2026 clarify several of these points, distinguishing between ancient inscriptions and comparative theories. The similarities between Egyptian temple design and the biblical descriptions are noted by scholars as part of the shared Near Eastern architectural tradition. They have distinct differences in scale. Oh, they're going to lie to you again, and I'm going to call them on it. The dimensions. Solomon's temple was approximately 90 feet long by 30 feet wide. In contrast, the precinct of Amun-Ra at Karnak is a massive complex spanning over 60 acres, with its main hall alone being significantly larger than the entire biblical temple. You see how they're lying? Okay, I'm going to read the rest of this, but I want to go back down here. Before we go on, we got to call them on that. I said, you said the Temple of Solomon was only 90 by 30 feet, but you know that that is the sanctuary and the court, not the rest of the dining halls and the apartments. The vast buildings around Karnak are exactly the same as Solomon's. The Karnak temple proper with the courts are the same dimensions as far as we can tell. Solomon's bronze pillars. All right, then I go into this other issue. And they argue and they say historical and archaeological findings, though, provide significant context regarding the architectural and linguistic parallels you noted. You are correct that the 90 by 30 foot measurement refers only to the core sanctuary of Solomon's temple as described in 1 Kings chapter 6, the full complex. The biblical text describes extensive surrounding structures, including a 3-story annex of side chambers, a vestibule, and multiple large courtyards. Egyptian parallels. Scholars have long noted that Solomon's palace and temple complex share striking architectural similarities with a New Kingdom Egyptian design, such as the Temple of Medamud near Luxor, and these include a tripartite arrangement in entry porch, main hall, inner sanctuary, open colonnade courtyards leading to enclosed holy spaces, the use of massive stone, cedar wood, and gold leafing. So you see, they admit they were lying, not just, misrepresenting, not just, saying something that could have been true but wasn't. So this whole thing where they say that Solomon's temple was 90 by 30 and the Amun-Ra temple was way bigger, they admit they were just lying to us. Why would they be lying if indeed they got all the evidence on their side? And then they go on to the pillars. The two pillars of Solomon's temple, Jachin and Boaz, were freestanding bronze columns at the entrance, while Karnak features massive stone obelisks and hypostyle columns. They served as structural supports or monuments to specific pharaohs rather than freestanding symbolic bronze pairs. Okay, let's go down and answer that one. Here, the pillars of Jachin and Boaz. While the Bible describes these pillars as cast bronze, your suggestion that they were bronze-coated stone reflects a common practice in ancient monumental architecture where precious metals were used as sheeting over stone or wood cores. The entrance pylons in Egyptian temples like Karnak, the entrance was typically flanked by massive stone pylons or flagpoles, often paired similarly to the freestanding pillars of Solomon. So they admit I'm right about that. Let's go back up here again. The pools. Both traditions use sacred lakes or basins for ritual cleansing. Karnak's sacred lake is a large rectangular pool used by priests, which some compared to the biblical Brazen Sea in Solomon's temple. They were located at the very same location at the southeastern corner of a temple facing east, which was also facing a Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives in Jerusalem today cannot be proven to have been there before BC. But the Mount of Olives that is in Egypt was there for thousands of years. The etymology of Solomon and Amun-Ra, mainstream linguistic identifies Solomon as originating from the Hebrew root SLM meaning peace. The theory that Sol-Amon, soul meaning sun, and Amun, Amun-Ra, Ra being soul, combines the Latin sol, sun, and the Egyptian Amun, is considered a folk etymology. They keep saying folk etymology. In other words, it sounds like it's true, but it can't be right because we don't agree with it. You are correct that no archaeological remains of the first temple, Solomon's, have been found on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is largely because destruction, the Babylonians destroyed it, and the excavation barriers. The Temple Mount is one of the most politically sensitive sites in the world, housing the Dome of the Rock and making large-scale archaeological excavations impossible. So you see, this greatest man of all of history, Solomon and King David, that built this massive city that all the world came and was taxed to see the glory of Solomon, can't find it anywhere. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have no tombs for them, the most important people in history. But we got these huge tombs for Osiris and Horus, and we've got an empty tomb in the Great Pyramid, and we've got the Temple of Karnak, which is identical to the Temple of Solomon, with a Mount of Olives, with the two pillars of Jachin, with the Pool of Siloam on the river Gihon, the Nile. Everything identical, but they don't think that it could be possible. So I said, you said the Temple of Solomon was only 90 by 30. All right, we read that. But you know that this is the sanctuary and the court and not the rest of the dining halls and the apartments. The vast buildings around Karnak are exactly the same as the Solomons. The Karnak temple proper with the courts are the same dimensions as far as we can tell. Solomon's bronze pillars were probably only bronze coated. The pillars were stone. You say it couldn't be the Nile because it was hundreds of miles away. But if Solomon's temple was at Karnak, it wouldn't be hundreds of miles away. You're using wording tactics to make it seem you have proof. But there is so little evidence, and it isn't proof. What I showed you is better evidence that Solomon doesn't mean peace, but Sol Amun, just like Arios, means holy, not Jiru or light. You are still slanting evidence toward the liars who did this elaborate hoax to make it seem Solomon's temple was the temple at Jerusalem, or Herod's Edomite temple. And why would Jesus and Lazarus, Osiris, be preaching at the house of On if it wasn't Heliopolis? Bethany is the house of On, or An. Historical archaeological findings. I already talked about the 30-foot, 60-foot measurements. The etymology of the house of On, the linguistic connections you propose are central to alternative historical theories that link the biblical narrative directly to Egypt. Beth-Ani and Heliopolis. In ancient Egypt, Heliopolis was known as Anu or On. The theory you mentioned suggests Beth Ani, Hebrew Beth Ananiah, is an adaptation of the house of On. Lazarus and Osiris. Some researchers argue that the name Lazarus is a Hellenized version of El Azar, which they link to the Egyptian deity Osiris, often called Asar or Usur, suggesting the raising of Lazarus in Bethany is a allegorical retelling of the Egyptian mystery plays centered in Heliopolis. Notice that Lazarus was raised up at Bethany, and the empty tomb of Osiris, Lazarus, is at Heliopolis. The lack of the 10th century monumental remains in that specific area of Jerusalem today remains as a point of intense scholarly and archaeological debate, leading many to investigate these Egyptian original locations as the possible source of the biblical narrative. Well, I rest my case, guys. Anywho, I guess I'll just leave it there, guys. We are way, way over. We got to end it there. I didn't intend to do this video all over again. I've done this basic type of video before, but I just had to share that with you this morning. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Tomorrow, we'll try to do another video, maybe about thoughts and mind and the manipulation of our society and word parallels and things like that. Who knows? We might do something else. I'll see you guys tomorrow. You guys have a good one. You know the Lord loves you, and His grace and His peace will always be with you. Have a good one.